Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. You know how we do it, digging into the sources you send in, and today it's all about South Africa. Specifically, Cyril Ramaphosa's time as president.
A fascinating one.
Yeah, and we've got quite the collection here. So the State of the Nation addresses from 2018 all the way to 2023,
Oh, wow.
plus some analyses of how he's actually done as president, and then there's this scandal. Can't ignore that.
Definitely not.
So what we're going to try to do is figure out, did Ramaphosa walk the walk after all that talking the talk?
Yeah, it's like holding up a mirror to those promises he made, right? Seeing if what he said matches up with what actually happened.
Exactly. And I think it's super interesting to track those speeches over time. Because you can see, were his priorities the same throughout? Or did they shift? And then, of course, does what he said he'd do actually line up with what South Africa experienced?
Absolutely. It gives us real insight into how he governed, what he focused on, and whether he was effective.
So we're going to hit some major themes that pop up in these SONAs. Things like job creation, always a big one. The economy in general. Then there's that energy crisis. South Africa has been dealing with all that load shedding. Land reform, always a hot topic.
Yeah.
And of course, this whole thing about fighting corruption.
Big promises there.
Yeah, big promises. And we can't forget that in 2024, the ANC actually lost its majority for the first time in 30 years.
Historic moment.
Right. So you have to wonder, does that mean Ramaphosa wasn't a good president?
Well, losing an election doesn't automatically equal bad president, but it does make you think, right? It makes you wonder how the public perceived his leadership. Did they feel like he delivered on what he promised?
Exactly. So let's jump right into it, starting with Ramaphosa's own words. 2018, SONA. Very optimistic, right? He's talking about a new dawn for South Africa, emphasizing unity, rebuilding trust, and tackling corruption head on.
New dawn. That's quite the image.
It is. And he gets specific. He says he wants to create 2 million new jobs for young people.
2 million.
Yeah.
That's ambitious.
It is. And alongside that, he's also pushing for broad economic growth, attracting investment. He seems to think a thriving economy will naturally lead to more jobs.
A classic trickle-down approach.
Kind of. But the question is, did it actually work? Did those 2 million jobs appear?
Well, it's complicated. Some initiatives were launched, things like the Youth Employment Service. But the reality is South Africa's unemployment rate, especially among young people, remained a huge problem.
So maybe that initial optimism was a bit too rosy.
Perhaps. And you see this reflected in his 2019 SONA. There's a noticeable shift.
Oh, really? How so?
He starts talking more about structural reforms and the need for foreign investment as the key drivers of job creation.
Okay, so less about direct job creation programs, more about setting the stage for growth.
Yeah, he even sets a target, raising 1.2 trillion rand in new investment over 5 years.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Did he pull it off?
There were some significant investment pledges, but did those translate into actual jobs, actual improvements in people's lives? That's another story.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's like there's this gap between what he says and what's actually happening.
And it gets even more complex when you factor in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hits.
Yeah, that threw everyone for a loop.
Absolutely. So understandably, his SONA that year is all about crisis management, saving lives, expanding social grants, supporting businesses.
So job creation kind of takes a back seat.
It does. But that underlying concern about unemployment, it doesn't go away.
Right, it's still this huge issue.
Exactly. By 2021, he's talking about Operation Valindla.
Okay, what's that?
It was an initiative focused on speeding up structural reforms in key sectors: energy, water, telecommunications.
Ah, so like laying the groundwork for long-term solutions.
Yes. But again, did those reforms actually gain traction? Did things actually improve? It's a little murky.
Yeah, I can see it. That would be hard to measure.
Right. And then in 2022, we see him highlighting the presidential employment stimulus, talking about how many temporary jobs were created.
So more of a Band-Aid solution than addressing the root causes.
Yeah, it raises questions about whether he was truly committed to solving those deeper problems or just trying to make things look better in the short term.
Okay, so we've seen how his approach to job creation kind of evolved over time.
Yeah.
Not exactly a clear success story. What about the overall economy? Did all that talk about growth and investment translate into actual progress?
Well, in his early SONAs, he's very optimistic, talking about making South Africa more business-friendly, pursuing structural reforms.
Right, trying to attract those investors.
Exactly. But despite those investment pledges, South Africa's economic growth remained pretty sluggish, even before the pandemic.
Yeah, and the pandemic obviously didn't help anyone.
No, it just exacerbated existing problems. And even in his later SONAs, when he's talking about economic recovery, those underlying challenges, unemployment, poverty, inequality, they're still there, deeply rooted.
So again, that gap between rhetoric and reality.
Yes, and that gap becomes even more apparent when we look at the energy crisis, something that directly impacts the lives of everyday South Africans.
Ah, yes, load shedding, the infamous power cuts.
Exactly. And it's a recurring theme in his addresses. In his 2018 SONA, he acknowledges the problem, promises to increase generation capacity, improve the performance of Eskom, the state-owned power utility.
Right.
And he talks about investing in renewable energy.
So he's trying to hit it from multiple angles.
He is. He even emphasizes a just transition to a low-carbon economy.
Which sounds great in theory, but in practice.
Well, his early plans relied heavily on Eskom.
Which, as we know, has had its fair share of issues.
Exactly. Corruption, mismanagement, aging infrastructure. So it's not surprising that load shedding just kept getting worse.
Despite his promises.
Right. It became this symbol of the government's inability to deliver. And ultimately, it led to a pretty drastic measure in 2023.
Which was?
He declared a national state of disaster in response to the energy crisis.
Wow. Okay. So that's a pretty big deal.
It was. It was an admission that things were dire and required extraordinary measures. He announced plans to speed up the procurement of new generation capacity, streamline regulations, encourage the use of rooftop solar.
So a lot of action, finally.
Yeah.
But I imagine there was some skepticism, too.
Oh, absolutely. Given his track record, that gap between words and actions in other areas, people were wary. And of course, the Phala Phala scandal didn't help matters.
Right. That adds a whole other layer to the story.
It does. It goes from broad economic policies to something much more personal. A break-in at Ramaphosa's own farm involving a significant sum of cash.
Yeah, we definitely can't ignore that.
No. It raises questions about his judgment, his integrity, whether he was truly living up to the image he presented in those speeches.
Okay, so before we dive into the scandal itself, let's quickly recap. We've looked at job creation, the economy, the energy crisis, and it seems like there's this consistent pattern. Ambitious promises followed by slow progress or even setbacks.
That's a fair assessment. And it makes the 2024 election result a bit less surprising. The ANC losing its majority for the first time in 30 years.
Right. It makes you wonder if voters were just tired of hearing promises that weren't being kept.
Definitely something to consider.
Well, on that note, I think it's time we unpack this Phala Phala scandal. See how it fits into the larger story of Ramaphosa's presidency? Stay tuned, because things are about to get interesting.
Okay, so Phala Phala. We're talking February 2020. A break-in happens at Ramaphosa's game farm. And get this, $580,000 is stolen.
Whoa, that's a serious amount of cash.
It is. And to make things even more interesting, this whole thing was kept quiet for 2 years.
2 years? Why, how?
Well, it was Arthur Fraser, the former head of state security, no less, who finally blew the whistle in 2022.
Hold on. He exposed it, but wasn't Fraser appointed by Ramaphosa himself?
He was. Quite the twist, right? Fraser filed criminal charges against Ramaphosa, accusing him of money laundering, corruption, possible tax violations, a whole 9 yards.
Wow. So what did Ramaphosa do?
He denied everything, of course.
Right.
Said the money was from a legitimate business, the sale of game animals, and that he'd reported the theft to his presidential protection unit.
But over $500,000 in cash, just lying around, that's a lot of game animals.
People definitely raised eyebrows. It didn't quite match up with the image Ramaphosa had cultivated, Mr. Transparency, Mr. Accountability.
Right. It's like that carefully crafted persona started to crumble.
Exactly. And this became a huge political scandal. Multiple investigations were launched. Parliament got involved. The public protector started digging. Even the South African Reserve Bank.
So surely with all that, someone found him guilty of something.
It's not that simple. The public protector actually cleared Ramaphosa, said there wasn't enough evidence to prove he'd violated any ethics codes.
Okay, so he was in the clear.
Well, not so fast. The NPA, that's the National Prosecuting Authority, they declined to prosecute.
What does that even mean?
It means they didn't think they had a strong enough case to win in court. Not enough evidence to guarantee a conviction. So technically, he wasn't found guilty, but he wasn't exactly exonerated either.
So this cloud of suspicion just hung over him.
Exactly, and it definitely damaged his reputation, especially when it came to his anti-corruption stance.
Right. How can you be the champion of fighting corruption when you're caught up in a scandal like this?
It made it very hard for people to take him seriously. Another example of that disconnect between words and actions.
Okay, so we've got this scandal brewing, but let's not forget those other big themes from his SONA's land reform. his whole fight against corruption. How did those actually play out?
Well, land reform has always been a tricky issue in South Africa, very sensitive.
Right, because of the history of apartheid and everything.
Exactly. In his 2018, SONA Ramaphosa talks about the need for equitable land redistribution, but he also stresses that it needs to be done responsibly without hurting agricultural production.
So walking a tightrope between addressing past injustices and maintaining economic stability.
Exactly. He talks about restitution, redistribution,
Yeah.
even expropriation, but always emphasizes a balanced approach.
Trying to reassure those who are worried about radical land seizures.
Right. But progress was slow, and some people felt he wasn't being decisive enough.
And then things get even more interesting in 2019, right?
Yeah, he announces plans to speed things up, mentions the possibility of expropriation without compensation.
Oh, okay. That's a big deal.
It caused a lot of controversy, both in South Africa and internationally.
I can imagine. People worried about property rights. The
Yeah.
economy is scaring off investors.
Exactly. But Ramaphosa insists that expropriation without compensation would only be used in specific situations, and that there would be a fair legal process.
So trying to calm the storm.
Yeah, but in his later SONAs you see a shift. The focus moves more towards supporting emerging Black farmers, developing the agricultural sector.
More of a pragmatic approach.
I think so. He talks about initiatives to provide training, financing, market access, but the pace of land reform remained a point of contention, and it's still an ongoing debate in South Africa.
Okay. So land reform. A mixed bag. Some progress, but still a lot of frustration. What about the whole anti-corruption fight? That was a big part of his platform.
It was. He came into office promising to clean up the government, address the legacy of state capture.
Wait, state capture. For our listeners who might not know, can you explain what that means?
Sure, state capture refers to a period in South Africa where private interests, often with corrupt motives, basically took control of government institutions, used them for their own benefit.
So essentially looting state resources.
Yeah, Ramaphosa was coming in after a period of, well, rampant corruption.
That's a tough act to follow.
It was. And in his SONAs, he talks a lot about strengthening institutions, appointing competent and ethical leaders, holding those responsible for corruption accountable.
He even created a special unit within the NPA to focus on corruption cases, right?
He did. The investigating directorate seemed promising at the time. But despite all these efforts, corruption remained a huge problem.
And then, of course, you have Phala Phala popping up,
Right.
which kind of throws a wrench in his whole anti-corruption crusade.
Exactly. It raises serious questions about his own ethical standards, casts a shadow over his entire legacy.
So looking back, Ramaphosa's presidency, it's a complex picture. He had this vision for a better South Africa, laid it all out in his SONAs. But the reality often didn't match up.
That's a good way to put it. And those scandals, especially Phala Phala, they really eroded public trust. Probably played a role in the ANC's election loss.
Yeah, but it's also important to remember he was dealing with some really deep-rooted challenges. It's not like he could fix everything overnight.
No. He inherited a very difficult situation, but ultimately it's up to each individual to decide how they view his legacy.
Right, whether he was more talk than action, or if he genuinely tried to make a difference.
Exactly. And that brings us to one final issue that really dominated his later years in office, the energy crisis.
Ah, yes. Load shedding. It was a constant struggle for so many South Africans.
It was. We know he talked about it in his SONAs. But what did those words actually translate to? Did he manage to turn things around? We'll delve into that next.
Okay, so we've talked about the promises, the realities, the scandals. But this energy crisis, it really loomed large over Ramaphosa's later years, didn't it?
It did. You can't talk about his presidency without talking about load shedding. It affected everyone, businesses, families, the whole economy.
It did. And we know he talked about it in those SONAs.
Yeah.
But what did he actually do? Could those promises lead to any real action?
Well, in the early speeches, he's focused a lot on Eskom, the state-owned power utility,
Right.
talking about improving its performance, bringing in more renewable energy sources, getting the private sector involved.
Trying to fix a system that was, well, pretty broken.
Yeah, and as you can probably guess, it didn't really work.
The load shedding just kept getting worse.
It did. Eskom wasn't the quick fix he'd hoped for, so he had to change tactics.
And that's where the 2023 State of Disaster Declaration comes in.
Right.
That was a pretty big move.
It was. It was basically admitting that the situation was critical. They needed to take drastic measures. So he laid out this plan to speed up the procurement of new generation capacity from all sorts of sources, not just Eskom.
So diversifying the energy mix.
Exactly. And he wanted to cut through all the red tape to get new projects approved faster.
He was also a big proponent of rooftop solar. Wasn't he empowering people to generate their own power?
Yes. That was a key part of the plan. Make it easier for people to install solar panels. Even feed excess energy back into the grid.
Okay, so a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
But I imagine there was some skepticism too.
Oh, definitely. Given the history of corruption, especially within ESCOM, people were worried that this state of disaster declaration would just open the door for more shady dealings.
And they had Phala Phala in the background too, which didn't exactly inspire confidence in Ramaphosa's ability to handle this whole thing transparently.
No, that scandal definitely cast a shadow over everything he did, made it harder for people to trust him.
So at the end of the day, did he actually manage to turn the energy crisis around?
Well, it's hard to say. His presidency ended before we could see the full effects of his plan. These things take time.
They do. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Cyril Ramaphosa's time as president, it's kind of a mixed bag. He clearly had a vision for South Africa, laid it all out in his SONAs.
He did. He talked about job creation, economic growth, land reform, fighting corruption. He set some ambitious goals.
He did. But as we've seen, the reality often didn't live up to the rhetoric. And those scandals, especially Phala Phala, they really hurt his credibility.
They did, and they likely contributed to the ANC's election loss.
It's a complex legacy. He was dealing with some very difficult problems that had been building up for decades.
That's true. But ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what they think of his time in office.
Right, whether he was a leader who genuinely tried to make a difference or someone who was more talk than action.
And that's what we encourage you to do. Keep thinking critically, keep questioning, keep exploring, because that's what these deep dives are all about.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this journey into Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency. Until next time, keep diving deep.